The higher up you go in a company, and depending upon how progressive they are with their management approach, a lot of times people come into the room and they expect to be order takers. So they're expecting the leader to know exactly what she or he, and they're looking to serve that up and go execute it. Now, the problem with this is that the leader is one person. They don't have all the information, and sometimes they're not close to enough of the details. So really the job of the leader is to kind of really calibrate the brain trust. It's why we have the working team.
Welcome to Chain of Learning, where the links of leadership and learning unite. This is your connection for actionable strategies and practices to empower you to build a people-centered learning culture, get results, and expand your impact so that you and your team can leave a lasting legacy. I'm your host and fellow learning enthusiast, Katie Anderson. Are you stuck between a state of utter chaos and the constraints of bureaucracy in your organization, trying to turn the ship around in the sea of uncertainty to become more innovative and agile, only to find yourself and your leaders stuck in the status quo, working on the same problems year after year? Well, it doesn't have to be that way. And I've brought seasoned transformational leader and C-suite executive Atif Rafiq to the show to help you discover how to lead change through uncertainty and ambiguity and get unstuck by turning unknowns into knowns sooner and moving to better decisions faster. Atif has reshaped industries and generated billions in revenue for some of the world's leading companies. He's held leadership roles in tech companies like Amazon, Yahoo, and AOL, and has held C-suite roles at multinational corporations, including McDonald's, Volvo, and MGM Resorts. And he's also the Wall Street Journal bestselling author of Decision Sprint, the new way to innovate into the unknown and move from strategy into action. Atif knows a thing or two about leading people through change, solving important problems, and creating value for organization. And he's here to share what he's learned along the way. We started off our conversation with a question about what shifts he had to make in his leadership and his approach to innovation and problem solving when he went from working in a highly innovative tech company like Amazon to joining McDonald's as the first ever chief digital officer in the history of the Fortune 500. Let's dive in. There was a time in your leadership where you switched organizations from a really innovative, creative culture to, a Fortune 500 as the first chief digital officer. And you had this realization that you had to completely change your leadership style. Take me back to that time and what that shift was like for you.
Well, Katie, talk about venturing into the unknown. I made a massive career shift where it was like switching from one planet to the other. So when I joined McDonald's, as you said, as their first chief digital officer, in fact, the first in the history of the Fortune 500, I was coming into like a culture that was very different from Amazon, where I had worked previously. And I suspect that's part of the reason why, they were attracted to someone with my profile is trying to bring in new ways of working. But at the same time, that is a journey. That's a learning curve. First, we have to understand the current culture and how a big company like McDonald's or Coca-Cola or GM actually works today. We have to sort of set a vision for what good looks like in terms of what is a different kind of higher velocity, higher innovation, higher risk-taking culture. And then we have to work really hard to get it from one spot to the other. So that was a process that took years. It wasn't a matter of weeks or months. It was sort of done one meeting at a time. When I arrived at McDonald's, the part that was actually simpler for me was setting the vision, so the what, and the more challenging part was then the how, in terms of how we shift the culture and the collaboration to get there.
What was, leading McDonald's to bring in a chief digital transformation officer in the first place? Like, what problem were they trying to solve by hiring you to come into the organization?
Basically, growth. I mean, the company had flat sales store sales growth. In fact, after I joined, then it turned negative. That was the first time in maybe 10 to 15 years that the company had experienced negative growth. And so there was a real mandate. There was a massive sense of urgency to do something strategic and to create, kind of platforms for long-term growth. So for McDonald's, in the end, that what we came up with was really to think about convenience in a different way. And of course, use digitization as a way to usher in a new level of convenience for customers, new ways of getting their food. And so really focusing on that pillar of convenience, which McDonald's had been known for, but kind of had lost touch with a little bit, and reformulating what that looks like for the digital age. That was the mandate.
How is it moving from this culture where it was, Amazon's a really creative, fast-paced, more entrepreneurial culture to one that's more of an established, long-standing, more probably traditionally run business for you as this, tech entrepreneur?
The difference is really the focus on the knowns versus the unknowns. In a very established company, um, you really get paid to kind of make ideas bulletproof, kind of from the beginning. And so you focus on the known commodities. Now, that has a consequence, which is that you tend not to get into new territory because you get shy, because there's a lot more unknowns than knowns. That's where Amazon excels, and of course, other companies as well,
Mm.
is a comfort level with the ambiguity, knowing that in the beginning, it's really about a ton of unknowns. And what you should measure yourself by is the rate at which you're kind of going into those rabbit holes, into those unknowns, making sense of them, coming back out, and then synthesizing like a point of view. Okay, we learned what we needed to learn, so we're confident in recommending a direction um, that is remains bold. When you focus on the known commodities, you're likely going to potentially shrink down the idea to something very safe. So you'll ship something, but it won't really be a game changer. It'll likely be a follower.
Tell me more about that. What's the risk to organizations if they sort of stay in that safe zone and focus only on sort of the known issues rather than navigating through that ambiguity?
Well, the key challenge I've found is actually cultural because let's say you have a working team and you have some senior executives, generally speaking, and they're accountable for like this big set of initiatives or the strategy. In a traditional culture, you might have the expectation as a working team that you know all the answers in the beginning, and that when you meet with senior stakeholders, that you have to package up package up this bulletproof plan, which is airtight and the probability of success is like really, really high. In a culture like Amazon, in the beginning, you want to get to that same spot, but in the beginning,
Mm.
you're comfortable with a lot of ambiguity, a lot of questions, and so it's okay in the beginning to say, we defined the problem, we won't have any answers, but we got a ton of questions. But at least we think these are the right questions to explore. And people nod their head, and at Amazon, that's progress. And then they say, come back in 2 weeks. Where are you on going down the rabbit holes of looking at these questions and making sense of them? What did you find out? What did you learn? What's your
Mm.
takeaways? What are your conclusions? And that's sort of your second touch point. And by your third touch point, of course, you're expected to have some really confident sort of recommendations that you can defend and put on the table. But the difference between that and the traditional culture is that your ideas probably remains elevated and a big one because you didn't shy away from the unknowns. They're actually factored into your thinking. You never shrank it down in the beginning to the known commodities. And that's quite a different ambition, if you will.
Yeah, there was a comment you made, or actually a phrase that you have in your intro that says problem solving needs to be reinvented for the modern era, and solving for the unknowns is the key. Because really, right, like our world is so ambiguous these days that if we rest on only the knowns, we're really going to get stuck. Uh, can you talk to me about the difference between boring problems and creative problems? So, Atif, what are boring problems?
Boring problems are ones which probably matter a lot to customers and that customers can feel, but they don't win you any awards in terms of being the most innovative thing to ship, so to speak. So an example would be, I thought I joined Volvo Cars, where I moved to after McDonald's to work on things like autonomous vehicles and connectivity and all the cool stuff that was coming down the pipe, you know, uh, towards the end of the 2010s. And I was. But when I arrived on the job, literally my first day, they told me that the main factory in Sweden was shut down, and it was the software glitch that was the cause of the problem. And so the XC90, which is the moneymaker, the cash cow for the company, we weren't producing these vehicles, and customers really wanted them. and the factory was shut down for 2 days, and that was costing the company millions of dollars. Now, the software in the manufacturing, site, it's old school stuff. It's COBOL. It just, it does boring stuff, right? It moves things down the assembly line. Um, that took priority. Obviously, I dropped everything, and I spent my first 2 weeks with a crack team getting our hands dirty and looking into why this was happening, not only some short-term fixes, but really the root causes. And the beauty of this situation was kind of like turning, a lemon into lemonade, where basically because we were able to give the attention and energy to a very customer, business oriented problem and get the company to the other side, it created a lot of credibility. So then later, when it came time for the big ideas around autonomous vehicles or connectivity or other things like new ways of thinking about infotainment in the car, our team had credibility that we would focus not only on the sexy stuff, but on the other things that matter. And so I think boring problems have a lot of value in terms of signaling to the culture that when it comes times for innovation, that there's a level of trust.
You made a comment to me that leaders need to start bringing more authentic interest to those daily boring problems. So as you said, that that you can then focus on the creative problems to keep innovating and moving the organization forward. What have been some more of your shifts that you've had to make, as you've evolved as a leader? So one is to get more authentic and interested in those boring problems. What are some other changes that you've had to make?
And back on the boring problems, it's like having two children, and one is innovation and one is the boring children. You got to love your children equally, right, Katie? And so if you're going to have deep curiosity, deep intensity around problem solving, apply it equally. That's really, really powerful stuff. It's also more inclusive because if you have a large team, let's say Volvo's had several thousand employees, you don't want to give a sense that they're the chosen ones that work on innovation, the other ones who just keep the business running. But coming to your question in terms of some other leadership insights that picked up along the way, one was the idea of the role of the leader focused on calibration over control. And let me break that down a little bit. The higher up you go in a company, and depending upon how progressive they are with their management approach, a lot of times people come into the room and they expect to be order takers. So they're expecting the leader to know exactly what she or he wants, and they're looking to serve that up and go execute it. Now the problem with this is that the leader is one person. They don't have all the information, and sometimes they're not close to enough of the details. So really the job of the leader is to kind of really calibrate the brain trust. It's why we have the working team. It's why we have the talent in the organization, and really help calibrate how are they defining the problem, what questions do they think are important to look into, what did they find out, how did they synthesize them, what conclusions are they drawing, how did they get there, based on that, what actions are necessary. I mean, it's not knowing all those things. It's actually calibrating how the team is thinking about them. Are there blind spots? Are we elevating our thinking? Is there someone in the company we can go get input from to do a better job of those things? That's what I call calibration. And my leadership evolved towards really a high calibration model, and to the point where people would be like, we met with him and he doesn't have any answers, like he's not telling us what to do. And of course, that's partially true and partially not true. It's just more about enabling teams, and I think good leaders enable teams.
I talk with so many leadership teams that we have to make this shift from being the expert with all the answers to, in your terms, being the leader who's calibrating, creating the conditions for people to bring forward their ideas and to problem solve and develop their own expertise around that. I call it breaking the telling habit, because as you said, people expect you to have the answer in this leadership role. And maybe that's one of the misconceptions of what leadership is that the leader has to have all the answers, versus what you're saying here is creating those structures and the calibration opportunities for problem solving.
In stable environments where things didn't change over decades, that was probably how made a lot of sense, because by being a veteran, so to speak, of the company or industry, you kind of saw everything. And the current situation probably is highly it's a strong fit of what happened in the past. But today that's completely nonsense. Like things change so fast. Just because you were, you know, focused on something 6 months ago doesn't mean that, all the kind of like contours of it today. So you really have to be hungry for input. You have to be obsessed for input. Good leaders are obsessed for input, not because they don't know things, but because they don't want to miss the knowable unknowns. That's the job. We have to get the
Mm.
knowable unknowns on the table. Once we do that and put it in the middle of the table, we have the right talent. The team will make the right sense of it.
So let's talk about how your thinking's evolved into your decision sprint model and this understanding of how you can navigate through that ambiguity better and move some of that thinking more upstream rather than just focusing on the knowns that are right in front of us.
Sure. Well, I wrote the book Decision Sprint, and it's mainly about the idea of upstream work, which is essentially the starting point may be a raw idea or an objective, and we have to get to a decision point because only after decisions are made and there's some degree of buy-in can we move on to execution. So it's not really a book about execution. I think there's a lot that's been written about that, and some cultures are really strong on that part. I think those cultures tend to struggle with the upstream part, which is essentially how do we, shorten the time and just keep, more effectiveness in the winding road of getting, from a promising idea to unlocking buy-in and decisions. And that's really upstream work. And the core thing that I focus on there are several things, of course, involved in upstream work, several stages. But one of the ideas I introduce is the idea of purposeful exploration.
Mm.
And to take a step back, I think we've all been in situations where there's a rush to judgment. Someone has a promising idea. Someone walks in the room and says, "Wow, McDonald's, we should do a subscription for coffee." And some people love it. Let's go make it happen and test it and move to experimentation. Other people hate it. And it's just a lot of judgment and a rush to opinions. What we should do instead, before we try and align on any of those perspectives, is actually build and run purposeful explorations. What are the key things? How are we framing the problem? What's the breadth and depth of kind of issues and questions we need to get our head around? And make that a thing, like a workflow, and then use that as the basis to formulate the recommendations. And so a lot of Decision Sprint breaks down the notion of upstream work into certain stages, the first of which is exploration.
And what I'm really hearing too is like we have to first understand what problem are we trying to solve, right? And and then have that exploration and maybe some experimentation around there too to understand, are we even having, is our thinking even moving in the right direction? How have you gotten more comfortable with experimentation and in that sort of learning process or exploration process in that upstream environment?
Well, I think experimentation is a double-edged sword. Sometimes it's actually a crutch. I would say if you're in a tech company, if you're at Google or you're at Meta, experimentation is actually a crutch because it seems like you're really busy and you're doing the right things because you're trying to get data, and who's gonna argue with, oh, we're getting data to make data-driven decisions, right? But like, what is the question your experiment is trying to answer? And is that the most fundamental or part of the core fundamental questions related to the problem we're actually trying to solve? Often you find it's not the case. It's like somewhat adjacent, so it's interesting data
Mm.
that you'll get from the experiment, but it's not going to put the team in a position to say, yeah, for sure, we have a lot of clarity. Let's roll. This is what we should be building. Um, on the other hand, if you're in a culture where there's no experimentation, right, then that's not a good thing either. So it's really finding the sweet spot of by defining the problem correctly and first coming up with the right set of questions, and then looking at how those questions are best answered. And sometimes it's an experiment, and guess what? Sometimes it's even faster than an experiment. It's common sense, it's institutional knowledge, it's a brain trust and a conversation. And those are also very important forms of collaboration and in terms of getting insight.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. There is sometimes like once you've defined that problem and done some thinking around it, there is that just do it sense. Like we actually know the answer to this. We don't necessarily need to do a lengthy experimentation. And I think this is tension in some of the organizations I work with that are trying to develop more of a problem solving culture. As you just shared, is that tension between wanting to create more experimentation and more problem solving, but not also pivot so far that we're not actually taking action or really making those decisions.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we talked about an example of a coffee subscription for McDonald's, and the instinct may be to operationalize it. Hey, can we make it work in the drive-through? Hey, how would I redeem it? Is the crew trained on at the counter to know what the heck I'm talking about and punch it into the POS? You know, all those things, very operational. But what are the merits of this idea? And I would tell you straight up that it's not because McDonald's wants $20 a month for coffee. It's because they want some of the times people do that for those same people to go get a sandwich because that's where the money is. And so it's about the cross sell, if you will, or the incrementality of the food purchases. So if that's really the main thing, make the main thing the main thing. How do we get our head around whether, that's going to happen or not? And that could be a different type of experiment or test. It may not be a customer facing test, right? It could be more some marketing analytics thing, or there may be another way to get some signals and some clues as to whether or not that will happen. And so we first want to set the parameters right, and then we can go crazy with different forms of acquiring data, so that we be more confident.
As exploring your book, and one of the concepts you talked about moving this upstream work is connecting exploration, which we've just talked about, and then alignment, so we can make better decision making. So talk to me a bit about the concept of alignment and how you have connected that exploration and decision making through alignment as an executive in your organization.
Well, I've had a frenemy relationship with alignment, and we're more on the friend side, but before we weren't. And the reason is because when I moved to Amazon to some of the well-known, the Fortune 500, I would often, after we had a promising idea, someone on my team had a big idea, maybe a peer of mine, very senior in the company, would say, "Hey, Atif, do you have a second? I really want to align on things." And I would say, "Sure, yeah, alignment's amazing. Let's do it." And so we'd sit there in the hallway, and eventually the takeaway was, how do we shut down this idea? Your team is crazy, and this is going to break the restaurants and our P&L or something like that. They kind of get carried away with the idea before at the embryo stage, right? And it'd be like, hold on one second. You're kind of making a ton of assumptions here. And if we made different types of assumptions, it could be a real winner. And we don't know either way. So let's find out, and how can we best find out? And so I went through a stage, to be honest with you, 11 years in the C-suite of the Fortune 500, where at first I said, I'm banning alignment. I don't want to hear this word. It's a bad word, and it means shutting good ideas down. But then I realized alignment can actually be powerful if we leverage exploration and we come into the alignment step with some high quality detective work, right? Because alignment is actually important. So I was wrong, because alignment is what gets enough people nodding their heads, and the buy-in is really essential for great execution. When people believe in something, then they're going to do a 2x or 3x better job of the execution. So it's worth showing them how we arrived there. So if we have purposeful exploration, we've kind of come up with the right recommendations, people understand how we drew those conclusions, then that is a step worth taking. So in the book, I talk about how to, prepare for alignment, what kind of package you put together to get people aligned. Once you have a high quality exploration, it could be something like a strategic narrative, like the narratives that Amazon does, but it doesn't have to be. That's just one form or medium. There's a lot of ways in which you can package things together to have people follow the thread of how you arrived at what you're suggesting as the direction of the idea or initiative.
And therefore then making the decision at the organizational level of which way you're going to go, but hopefully in your direction.
And often, to be honest with you, Katie, non-decision decision meetings, which are the best ones. And I've been in those and I love them and I knew they were going to happen because I was very confident in the upstream work. You know, the people we hire in companies are there for a reason. They're usually very bright. They're very,
Mm.
they know their stuff. They've seen a lot of things over the years. So, um, if they see the right thread, they see the work behind it, how we got there, they can follow it, and it's a calculated bet. They're going to go for it. So there's so many non-decision decision meetings
Mm.
where it's not high stakes because we did the right upstream work, and that's my hope for people in teams.
That's my hope as well. There's a Japanese word that's nemawashi, which means tilling the soil. And it's exactly what you said here. It's all of the work before the meeting. So you're not actually truly making, it's that no decision meeting because you've already really brought people along on that thinking journey. It's why Toyota has been so successful and in using a document called A3 thinking, because it's sharing all the thinking and taking people on that exploration journey of defining the problem. How are we thinking about it? What are the things we've done, so that the alignments already happen before you're getting to the meeting? And it seems like that's a big counter intuitive thing to a lot of I guess American and Western companies.
Well, it's so powerful. In fact, I've been in the best cases, what I see is you spend like 2 minutes on the decision because it's everyone's already in agreement, and you literally spend the rest of the meeting talking, accelerating the
Mm.
execution. So you're like, oh, what do we need to move around? What dollars can I move from here to here to allow this to happen? Okay. So you start actually accelerating the idea and the execution quite a bit. It's a really funny human dynamic, to be honest with you, because a lot of times the team that's accountable for the idea or the product thought they were going in to get a yes or no, but they're actually getting a ton of help of people like clearing the way for them. And that's a really great feeling.
That's Nemawashi done right, or all of that alignment work that you are talking about. Like, let's bring it upstream so that at the meeting we're actually talking about what we're going to do with it and how to move forward. Uh, you know,
100%. Yeah.
I was reading your book and I was really struck by a phrase in there. It reminded me of a visit that I had recently to a tech company called Menlo Innovations and talking with their CEO, Rich Sheridan. And it was something you said, almost something that was almost exactly what he said too, that without a method for handling upstream work, companies must choose between bureaucracy and chaos. And he had a diagram that as a tech company, they were constantly trying to either navigate between bureaucracy and chaos, and it just felt stuck. And so I thought that was a really powerful, similar comment that you made. So how do you see the difference between bureaucracy and chaos, and how can you avoid being stuck in between those two?
Well, I think the essential difference, Katie, is that, chaos is really more personality driven. And that could be because there's a very strong, leader at the top. It could be because it's still a founder-led culture, and that's not a bad thing. I love founders. Um, but it could be a little bit more personality driven versus like systematic. Like, how do we decide what we work on and yeah, what gets the priority? Um, on the other hand, the bureaucracy is like you don't really know who's in charge, right? It's almost like
Mm.
we're doing things for the sake of it. So, we did these three things last year, and these three things will continue, and here's the project plan, and then you're able to poke a lot of holes in there, and you can't connect those things to the higher level purpose of the organization, their strategic pillars, and then how we connect and cascade the work that we're actually doing within a given team up through that.
Mm.
And you should be able to do a good amount of that. That's not always possible, but you should be able to connect it to the higher level purpose and objectives. Um, and then, the other feature of bureaucracy is one where, it's just very difficult, where the plans are set out well in advance, right? So the plans are actually perfect from the beginning. And so there is not a really appetite in the bureaucracy for exploration because everything has to add up all the time to, to a near certain outcome, right? So we're not in a, in
Mm.
a in a different type of environment. We're not as much outcome focused in the beginning. We want a huge outcome, but we're really trying to understand the problem. And so some comfort level with
Mm.
exploration of the problem space. You know, we need to find that middle ground.
A lot of the organizations I work with are also in these like large bureaucratic organizations like healthcare or government, or many different organizations where a lot of those best policies and procedures are put in place because they're trying to control the chaos. But what I'm hearing from both you and Rich Sheridan is like, if we can move the upstream work to get better at decision making, we're going to actually be able to remove more of that chaos and the bureaucracy at the same time.
Well, healthcare is an interesting example because when something is scaled out to patients and lives are involved, you know, we want a really high level of precision, right? So we want some of the, you know, that stability and the controls. Now, the question is like before we get there, before we're scaling something or rolling it out, you know, we want a different system. So there's a system you need for execution, which I fully agree needs high level precision and control and more like guaranteed type of outcomes. Like these mistakes won't happen. And then there's a system that we need before we get to decision points when something is still essentially like trying to be understood and the direction is trying to be set. The decisions haven't been made. You know, the plans are not set yet. And that's a very different model. We don't want to use an execution system to manage the upstream part. So just even recognizing the difference between upstream and downstream can be very powerful, and have a system that's built for purpose for each one, I think is a huge unlock for organizations.
How can organizations start getting better at making that recognition or that difference between upstream and downstream work?
Well, it's a great question. I think they're basically they should start with their strategy, you know, and they know their strategic pillars. They're usually able to break those down into several, you know, key initiatives, and then that's where they should start. So the new territory, essentially, like, oh, we know we can be the same as last year if we just do things a little bit better, but we're not going to get that 10% or that 5% or that 20% unless we start getting some of the new things to land. So that's really where we should focus on putting in the upstream systems. Now, some companies have different names for that. Some call it innovation, and some that's just regular sort of product development. The labels are less important, but it's the new territory, the problem-solving frontiers, that if you cross those frontiers well, you know there's going to be huge value. That's where you need to put in an upstream system and approach.
And making that connection then to, you know, there's the creative problems maybe are more upstream and the boring problems are downstream perhaps. And how do you balance those two as well? Am I right in making that connection, or do you see that differently?
I think, you know, the boring problems can have a lot of ambiguity as well, you know, you know, and we've got to also remember that, you know, every new idea after its birth, and if it takes flight and is launched, you know, has a shelf life of years and years. So there's always some problem-solving horizon for an idea. And so the idea of continuous exploration is also powerful. So just to kind of tie a couple of things together, it's not just about launching an idea or a brand new idea. You might be in year 4 of an idea. I mean, when I think about Volvo, we launched a subscription for cars, all inclusive, include the insurance and everything else, you know, and you can get it from your phone and have it delivered to your house, so you didn't have to go to the dealer. You know, we launched that in 2018. It's now 6 years later, and when I talk to people in the company, they have problems that are, you know, really, really interesting, really meaty, really meaningful, that they need to get their head around. So, you know, it could be years into an idea and still have some frontier. It's always the next wave of you know, elevating that idea. But I do think it includes the boring ones for sure.
Thank you for elaborating on that. I want to end on this one quote that you have at the end of your book that really stood out to me, because it is the challenge, the number one challenge that leaders across the globe share with me that really inhibits problem solving, I guess, whether it's the boring problem or the creative problem in their organization, but they don't have time for problem solving or to support their teams in problem solving because they're firefighting all the time, just running from problem to problem, putting the fires out. And your quote is, "A company of firefighters can, at best, maintain the status quo." So what's your suggestion for how leaders and practitioners can get out of this firefighting mode and actually move beyond the status quo?
The C's do part from time to time in corporations where the C's part and you don't have a firefight or several of them going on. And that's your opportunity to really say, okay, what is strategic? What is ambiguous? What could be, something that could grow into something really amazing? And now how do I kind of roll up my sleeves and work with the team, enable teams to do some really interesting problem solving around this. Give them, work with them, calibrate the work, give them psychological safety, give them space, give them some cover, and then plant those seeds. So, we alternate between, firefighting and planting seeds, firefighting and planting seeds. And so, just a reality of working in a corporation is there may be, extended periods where you don't have the time to plant the seeds because you don't want the forest to burn down. I totally get that. But those windows of opportunity do come up and we have to take advantage of them. The good news is when we plant those seeds, we're really surprised a couple months later, crack team and what they've come up with, what that's grown into. It's really powerful. And then other people see that, other teams see it, and they want to be in that mode as well. It's a lot of great oxygen for them. So they start figuring out, well, how do I bring that into my way of working? And it can be a very powerful thing that adds up over time.
And it can be something simple too, like asking just a few more questions or giving a little bit more time for someone to think and not just like rushing in and always giving your answer, just like pausing a little bit. So it doesn't have to be this huge leap for this whole creative like thinking space, but how do you start creating those little maybe micro moments for thinking and problem solving and creativity?
And that's well said too, Katie. It's a different mode. So just recognizing the mode you need to be in with the people you're with. Because you're in a Zoom meeting or a real meeting room, whatever, and people come in as firefighting and you're carrying that mode over to the next one. You don't have to do that. You might be with a team that actually has more space and more capacity for critical thinking and creativity. And so now you need to make that shift and you need to become your parenting style needs to shift. Let me put it that way.
Yeah. As I always say, the best leadership learnings I have is through parenting and practicing how to parent my children. So apply it at work as well. Thank you, Atif, for coming on Chain of Learning and for sharing your insights about your book that are included in your book, Decision Sprint, and from your years of leadership and experience in a multitude of different types of organizations.
Katie, it's been a pleasure joining you. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Well, look forward to continuing the conversation. Uncertainty is what all of us are facing in our organizations and our lives today. Relying on old leadership and problem-solving approaches that are based on certainty and the knowns will only keep us stuck in the status quo, firefighting and trying to solve the same problem unsuccessfully year after year. Atif shared so many examples and strategies in this episode about how you can become a more effective leader by navigating unknowns and getting to decisions faster, what he calls the decision sprint. As change leaders, whether you're an executive, manager, team member, or change practitioner, your ability to move decisions upstream and to enable faster decision-making will be the key to your success in getting the results that your company needs. I encourage you to check out Atif's Wall Street Journal bestselling book, Decision Sprint, for even more stories, frameworks, and tactics about how you can navigate ambiguity and move from strategy to action, and to connect with Atif on LinkedIn. I'll put the links in the full episode show notes. And if you haven't already listened, I also recommend going back to episode 8 of this podcast, where I talked with Steve Spear and Gene Kim about strategies for effective problem solving and innovation in complex organizations, and their book, Wiring the Winning Organization. As well as listen to episode 13, where I dive deeper into how you can break the telling habit and make that shift from the expert with all the answers to a leader who creates the conditions for problem solving and innovation through asking better questions. Reflect on what Atif and I discussed in this episode about how you can start making ambiguity more actionable in your organization. How can you conduct that tilling of the soil, the nemawashi, so that you can have more non-decision decision meetings by asking decisions, framing the problem that needs to be solved, and aligning your stakeholders sooner by taking them along on the thinking journey? Identify one action that you can take in the next 2 weeks to create the conditions for better thinking and get out of that constant firefighting mode or being the leader who has all the answers. Then put it into action and take time to reflect on how it goes and how what you're learning is contributing to better understanding of the real problems that you need to solve for yourself, for your teams, and for your organization. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow or subscribe now to Chain of Learning and share this podcast with your friends and colleagues so that we can all strengthen our chain of learning together. And if you're enjoying the show, please rate and review it on your favorite podcast player. Thanks for being a link in my chain of learning today. I'll see you next time. Have a great day.